Good morning. I'm going to teach you some Hebrew words. So usually I am preaching on Saturday mornings on Shabbat, and I greet my congregation with the words Shabbat Shalom. It's not Shabbat for me. I don't know actually if it is for you or not. But it is the first day of the week for me. And the way that Jews might greet each other on the first day of the week is Shavua Tov. So I wish you a Shavua. Everyone say Shavua. Tov, which just means good week. So now you can impress your Jewish friends and neighbors. I'm so glad to be with you here this morning, and I was so glad to be invited by Reverend Katrina to share this day with you. And I didn't know several weeks ago when I was invited that this was going to be such a big week for me. And I didn't know several weeks ago that on Shabbat morning when I began services at B'nai Keshet that I would have a group of Christians standing outside holding signs with hearts on them. And it was a very emotional day. So I'm getting to spend a lot of time with Christians this weekend. And I'll share that when I was first ordained, I was not comfortable in church settings, and I was always on edge, waiting to hear the whiff of supersessionism or caricatures of Jews spoken from the pulpit, which I heard. And I'm so grateful that I live in a place now and I serve in a place now where I don't fear joining you, and I'm glad to join you. So thank you for welcoming me so warmly. And did not expect to say this, but the other thing I love about church services is that you print the music in the book so I can sing along. Thank you for that. So this week, beginning today, in synagogues around the world, we will be reading from Parshat Vayera, which is the section of Torah that we just heard the beginning of. Thank you, Rob, so much for that lovely reading. And lectionary is a word that's actually totally foreign to Jews, but we do have one. And our lectionary involves reading all of the Torah in the 5 books of Moses throughout the course of a year, which we just do in order, which makes things simple. So the first 2 verses of this week's Torah portion have troubled Jewish readers for thousands of years. And just an aside, when I read the text of Torah, I use the word Hashem to refer to God. That word means the name, and it's a word that Jews often use to replace God's name, Yud-He Vav-He, for which Lord is a euphemism. So I'm reading from the beginning of Genesis 18 again, just to remind ourselves. Hashem appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he was sitting at the entrance of the tent at the hottest time of day. Looking up, Abraham saw, in Hebrew it says Hine, which is like, lo, wow. Look, 3 men standing. In Hebrew it says alav, which means like upon him. They're right there. So the rabbis asked, how did God visit Abraham? In what way did God visit Abraham? Why did God visit Abraham? And why was Abraham sitting at the entrance of his tent in the middle of the day, a time when any tent-dwelling person knows is nap time? So the rabbis respond, God does the mitzvah of visiting the sick. Abraham has just circumcised himself, and therefore God visited him. Of course, God has no form, no body, no distinct presence in Jewish tradition. So how might God visit a person? Perhaps through visions and dreams and voices which Abraham has received in the past, but more practically through messengers. And why do these messengers visit at such an absurd time of day? The rabbis teach us. They knew something about our father Abraham. His very essence was hospitality. While others were huddled in their tents and slept off the afternoon heat, which is the wise thing to do, he had his tent open in all 4 directions, constantly scanning the landscape for weary travelers in need of rest and sustenance. He knew that if his tent were closed, perhaps a traveler would perish in the heat or die of thirst. And not only is his tent open, he begs his visitors to stop, even if they don't think they need to. He brings out his most precious foods to sate them. He washes their feet. There's no bare minimum when it comes to Abraham. He was always a little extra. And I relate to Abraham in this particular way. Every week, it feels like a slog to just get through those last hours of Friday to make it to Shabbat. On Friday nights, I should be putting myself to bed early and getting enough rest to get up on Saturday morning. But invariably, I do the opposite. I make an elaborate meal somehow. It's actually the only night of the week that I reliably cook. I invite over guests. I open my home often to another family because it's just not Shabbat for me without those elements. And I stay up way too late schmoozing every time. And this terribly bad habit of mine has a paradoxical effect. I don't feel more tired. I feel more alive. I feel more energized. I feel more purposeful. Now, you may have guessed that I'm an extrovert. So your mileage may vary, as they say. But this is a truth about human community. We need to be nourished by others. We need to serve as Abraham did. We even need to rail against God on behalf of others, another form of service, as Abraham will do at the end of this chapter. We have an absolute need to be up in everybody's business, in the best possible ways. Somehow on Friday afternoons, if I'm only cooking for my own little family, there never seems to be much left in the fridge. But if I'm cooking for 8 or for 10, I have enough to feed an army. Blessings in this way seem to multiply by being shared. At the end of the passage we read this morning, Sarah receives an unexpected blessing, and I'll just pause for a moment and say, I wasn't expecting that song about Sarah, but it's so beautiful. Thank you for that. Finally, unexpectedly, after decades of prayer, after she has given up all hope, she is promised that she will become a mother. And she responds, I would say appropriately, with shocked laughter. On its surface, it's easy to read Sarah as simply lacking in faith. God's response, is there anything too wondrous for Hashem, might underscore that reading. How could she scoff at God's blessing, at the prophecy brought by these messengers? But that is not how Jewish wisdom reads this text. On the contrary, it is unbelievable to classic commentators that Sarah could be anything less than faithful. Sarah is known as a person who went out from the place of her birth with Abraham, who made a community of God followers. She is faithful. So they explain her laughter in all kinds of ways. They suggest, perhaps because she was overhearing from the tent, Sarah didn't realize these were God's messengers. Perhaps she thought they were simply human guests, offering a classic, polite blessing rather than a prophecy. Or perhaps she thought the men were indeed prophets, but believed her own physical condition could not be reversed except by divine intervention, not simply prophetic announcements. And even with her doubt, she was careful to laugh soundlessly, internally, so as not to embarrass the guests who might overhear her laughter. I believe there's another reason Sarah might have laughed. For Sarah, in a household that has already been blessed with a child, fulfilling God's promise to Abraham, it may seem impossible that there is room for more blessing. The one favorite child already exists, and his name is Ishmael. I remember playing with my children when they were much smaller, when they were the age of people who might come up and pester me while I'm leading services. I remember the drama that surrounded every game of make-believe. It didn't matter how many cars or dolls or action figures or stuffed animals there were in the house. There was always one that consumed all of a child's attention, the one favorite toy, the toy that caused every meltdown. For Sarah, the possibility of another child, the possibility of 2 favorite children, the possibility of a blessing that multiplies was impossible. This is exactly why God reappears in the text. We hear from the messengers and not from God, but now we hear from God. Sarah needed to hear it with her own ears. She needed to hear it from the source. We can read God's strong response, not as a rebuke, but as assurance, as comfort, as a confidant speaks to a friend. You did laugh. It's okay. This is real. Sarah's story does not end as well as it began. Like a small child with too much power, Sarah turns her own blessing eventually into cruelty against Hagar and Ishmael. She does not accept the possibility that blessings multiply. She believes fully in the scarcity of success. She is consumed by the fear that if one person gets what they truly deserve, there cannot possibly be enough for everyone else. I want to offer to you today the possibility that there is enough for all of us, a possibility Sarah cannot see. We scoff at the possibility of plenty like Sarah because it feels unreal and unattainable. But there is enough divine love, even if we no longer believe that divine love overcomes medical truths like infertility. There are enough resources. There is enough human energy. There is enough human loving kindness. There is enough solidarity, as I saw this weekend. There is enough food on the table if only we know how to share it. There is a classic Jewish story about the difference between heaven and hell, which is funny because Jews don't really believe in heaven and hell, but we do have stories about them. That's how Jews believe in things. The difference between heaven and hell is that they look identical. You are seated at a table that is full of food. There are people who are seated all around that table, but each person is given a spoon that's too long. So they can't feed themselves. You're struggling with your spoon over the food, if you can imagine. Hell is when you're trying to feed yourself with that spoon. Heaven is when you are trying to feed the person across the table from you. There are enough blessings for all of God's children, if only we commit to sharing them. Thank you for sharing the blessing of this day with me. Thank you for sharing your spirit and energy and love. And I hope that we can commit to continue to sharing those blessings with each other, with our wider Montclair community, with Essex County, bigger and bigger. Thank you, and Shavua Tov.